I found out my dead father had a secret family, so I showed up at their door and claimed my half of everything. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 months after we buried my father. I was still going through his papers when the lawyer called about some documents that needed my signature. Nothing prepared me for what I found inside that manila folder. My hands trembled as I held the birth certificates, marriage license, and bank statements that painted a picture of a man I thought I knew. My father had been married to another woman for 15 years, had 2 kids with her, and owned a house in the suburbs just 40 minutes from where I grew up. The rage hit me like a freight train. All those nights he said he was working late, all those business trips, all those times he missed my baseball games because he was too busy. He was building another life while I was desperately trying to get his attention. I spent the next week in a haze, calling in sick to work and drinking my way through his liquor cabinet. My mom had died when I was 12 and he was all I had left. Now I felt like I had nothing again. The address on the papers burned into my memory. I drove past their house twice before I worked up the courage to knock. It was bigger than ours, nicer, with a swing set in the backyard and bikes scattered on the front lawn. A woman answered the door with flour on her apron and concern in her eyes. She looked to be in her early 40s, with kind features and graying hair pulled back in a ponytail. Behind her, I could see family photos covering the mantel, and my father's face smiled back at me from every single one. I told her who I was and watched her face crumble. She invited me in with shaking hands and called for her children. A boy who looked about 14 came down the stairs, followed by a girl maybe 10 years old. They both had my father's eyes. The woman, whose name I learned was Sarah, made coffee while I sat in their living room trying to process the normalcy of it all. This wasn't some sordid affair or secret he was ashamed of. This was a full life, complete with soccer practice schedules on the refrigerator and homework spread across the kitchen table. Sarah told me everything through tears that wouldn't stop flowing. She met my father at a conference 20 years ago, back when I was just 8 years old. They fell in love, got married in a small ceremony, and built what she thought was a perfect life together. She never knew about me or my mother. He told her he had no family, that his parents were dead, and he was an only child. She believed him completely, because why would anyone lie about something like that? The kids sat there in stunned silence as their world collapsed around them. The boy kept looking at me like I was some kind of monster, and the girl just stared at her hands. I felt like the villain in their story, even though I was just as much a victim as they were. Sarah showed me documents that proved my father had been supporting this family financially for years. The house was in both their names, along with 2 cars, a boat, and several investment accounts. Everything I thought would be mine was actually split between 2 families he never told about each other. I demanded my half of everything right there in their living room. The rage was consuming me and I couldn't think straight. Sarah begged me to wait to let her figure things out, but I was past caring about their feelings. The next few weeks were a nightmare of lawyers and court dates. Sarah hired an attorney who tried to argue that since their marriage came after my parents' divorce, she had more legal claim to the assets. My lawyer pushed back hard, claiming that bigamy invalidated their marriage entirely. During one particularly brutal court session, Sarah's son stood up and screamed at me that I was trying to steal their home. His sister started crying, and I felt something crack inside my chest. These kids were innocent in all this, just like I had been. That night, I went back to my father's house and sat in his study for hours. I pulled out photo albums I hadn't looked at in years and found pictures of him teaching me to ride a bike, helping me with science projects, and cheering at my high school graduation. But then I found something that changed everything. Hidden in his desk drawer was a journal he'd been keeping for the past 5 years. The entries revealed a man torn apart by his own choices, desperately trying to find a way to tell both families about each other. He wrote about missing important moments in all our lives because he was trying to be present for someone else. He wrote about the guilt that was eating him alive and the fear that coming clean would destroy everyone he loved. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before his heart attack. He had decided to tell Sarah about me and my mother, and he had planned to tell me about them too. He wanted to bring both families together to try to make things right somehow. I realized that his death wasn't just a tragedy for me, but for all of us. Sarah and her kids had lost the man they thought they knew, just like I had. We were all grieving the same person, even if we had known different versions of him. The next morning, I called Sarah and asked if we could meet without the lawyers. She agreed, and we sat in a coffee shop while her kids were at school. I showed her the journal, and we both cried as we read his words together. Sarah told me about the man she married, the one who made pancakes every Sunday morning and never missed a school play. I told her about the father who taught me to drive and stayed up all night helping me with college applications. We started to piece together the full picture of who my father really was. He wasn't the monster I had imagined in my anger, but he wasn't the saint either of us had thought he was. He was just a flawed man who made terrible choices and then didn't know how to fix them. Over the following months, Sarah and I worked together to settle the estate. Instead of fighting over every asset, we found ways to divide things that honored both families. She kept the house where her kids had grown up, and I took the smaller property my father had been planning to sell. The hardest part was explaining everything to her children. They struggled to understand how their father could have lied to them for their entire lives. The boy, whose name was Jake, refused to speak to me for weeks. The girl, Emma, was curious but cautious. Sarah suggested we try having dinner together once a month, just to help the kids process everything. Those first few meals were awkward and painful, but gradually something shifted. Jake started asking me questions about what our father was like when I was growing up. I told him about the camping trips and fishing excursions, the way our father would sing off-key in the car and tell the worst jokes imaginable. Jake shared stories about weekend basketball games and the elaborate Halloween decorations our father put up every year. Emma was fascinated by the idea that she had an older brother. She asked if I would teach her to drive when she got older, the way our father had taught me. Something about that question broke down the last wall I had built around my heart. We discovered that our father had given us similar advice over the years, used the same phrases, and even told us some of the same stories. He had been consistent in his love, even if he had been dishonest about everything else. The financial settlement took almost a year to finalize, but by then it felt less important than the relationships we were building. Sarah and I had become unlikely friends, bonded by our shared confusion and grief. Jake started calling me his brother instead of his half-brother. Emma asked if she could come stay with me for a weekend, and we spent 2 days going through photo albums and watching old movies our father had loved. I found myself becoming protective of them in a way I hadn't expected. When Jake was having trouble at school, I offered to help with his homework. When Emma was nervous about starting middle school, I told her stories about my own awkward teenage years. Sarah started dating someone new about 18 months after our father's death. I was surprised to find that I was happy for her. She deserved to find love again, and her new partner seemed like a good man who understood the complexity of our situation. The kids accepted him gradually, and he never tried to replace their father or pretend our family dynamics were normal. He simply made space for all of us in their lives, which I appreciated more than I could express. 2 years after that first knock on their door, Jake graduated from high school. I sat in the audience next to Sarah and watched him walk across the stage, knowing our father would have been proud. Emma had saved me a seat, and she held my hand during the ceremony. At the graduation party, Jake thanked me in his speech for being the brother he never knew he needed. He said that losing our father had been devastating, but finding each other had helped heal some of the pain. I realized that my quest for revenge had accidentally led me to something much more valuable than money or property. I had found a family I never knew existed, and they had welcomed me despite the circumstances. Sarah and I still meet for coffee sometimes, sharing memories of our father and laughing about his quirks. We've stopped trying to figure out why he made the choices he did, focusing instead on making sure his grandchildren know they are loved. Emma is in high school now, and she calls me when she needs advice about boys or college applications. Jake is studying engineering, following in our father's footsteps, and he texts me pictures of his projects. I kept my father's journal, and sometimes I read it when I miss him. His words remind me that people are complicated, that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to, and that forgiveness is sometimes the only path forward. The house feels less empty now that I have people to invite over for holidays. Sarah brings her famous apple pie every Thanksgiving, and Jake always volunteers to carve the turkey. Emma has claimed the guest room as her own, decorating it with photos of all of us together. Looking back, I understand that my father's greatest gift wasn't the inheritance I thought I deserved, but the family I never knew I needed. His death brought us together in a way his life never could have, and for that, I find myself grateful instead of angry. The secret he kept for so long became the foundation for something beautiful and unexpected. We are not a traditional family, but we are a real one, built on shared grief, mutual forgiveness, and the love of a man who is both better and worse than any of us knew.